strict control, coercion, violence, sexual crimes, and a years-long system of silence. When I started looking into this topic, specifically how Neville Cooper found his first followers, it became clear that it was neither accidental nor instantaneous. He didn't just stand at the pulpit and wait for people to come to him. He traveled, searched, persuaded, and selected. Today we will dive into the history of the creation of one of the sects. But what's important is that this community still exists today. So before we start diving into the dense thickets of New Zealand, make sure you're subscribed to my channel. Like and leave your comments. So let's begin. In the 1950s and 1960s, Cooper traveled extensively around Australia as an itinerant evangelist. He held services in small towns in Queensland and New South Wales, preaching in temporary tents that he organized himself. This format was not new, but Cooper stood out among other preachers for his radicalism and intensity. His speeches were not gentle. He spoke about hell, punishment, sin, a corrupted world, and the imminent end of times. He often emphasized that traditional churches had lost their way and that only complete submission to God's order could save a person. It was during this period that he created a traveling ministry called The Voice of Deliverance. He would set up large tents with this name, and in some cities his sermons would last for hours. According to the testimonies of people who heard him at the time, Cooper was very charismatic. He knew how to hold people's attention and was very skilled at working with fear. He did not offer comfort, he offered salvation from terror. He paid special attention to people who were already vulnerable, young families, women in difficult marriages, people with trauma, those who had experienced loss or a crisis of faith. He spoke a lot about the proper family, about clear roles, about a world without chaos. For some, this sounded like the answer to all their questions. So by the mid-1960s, several dozen regular followers had already formed around him. It's hard to name an exact number, but researchers agree that at the peak of his itinerant activity in Australia, he had about 40 to 60 devoted followers who regularly traveled with him and helped organize services. The turning point came in 1965. It was then that Cooper was involved in a plane crash near Brisbane. The plane he was piloting suffered serious damage, but everyone on board survived. This incident was widely covered by local media, and Cooper immediately began using it in his own preaching. He said that God had spared his life for a reason, that it was a sign of a special mission. For his followers, this became almost a mystical confirmation of his uniqueness. It was after this that he began to speak not just about faith, but about building a separate community. He repeated more and more often that true Christians could not live among a sinful world, that isolation was not an escape, but a path to salvation. This idea matured over several years. In 1967, Cooper, together with his family and some of his followers, moved to New Zealand. He explained this by saying that Australia had become spiritually deaf, while New Zealand, in his words, was a purer land. During the first years, he did not have a permanent place to stay. He moved from church to church, trying to find a place where he could take on a leadership role. But almost everywhere he clashed with the leadership because he recognized no authority except his own. In 1969, after a final break with one of the churches in the Rangiora region, Cooper took a group of people with him. It was then that he openly declared for the first time that he no longer submitted to any church or church structure. This group began to be called the Cooperites. At that time, it was about 30 to 40 people, mostly families with children. They began living very modestly at first. There was no large land, no infrastructure, but even then, Cooper introduced key rules: communal labor, shared property, and a ban on making personal decisions without his permission. People were told that this was temporary until God showed them the next step. This next step happened at the end of the 1970s, when the group purchased land in the Springbeck area. It was there that the fully fledged closed community began to take shape. By this time, the number of followers had grown thanks to the birth of children and the joining of new families. According to various estimates, by the early 80s, more than 100 people were already living in the community. A particular, almost cynical fact was that Cooper understood the power of image very well. When journalists started coming to the community, he always showed the same things: children playing, communal meals, smiles, order. He never showed how decisions were made, never how punishments were given, never what happened behind closed doors. Another important point, which is rarely discussed, is that Cooper systematically changed people's names. In the 1980s and 1990s, he began to encourage and later even require community members to change their names to biblical or virtue-based ones. This isn't just a strange tradition, it's a way to erase a person's previous identity. When someone loses even their own name, it becomes much harder for them to remember who they were before the system. So by the early 90s, the community was already almost completely closed off. People were encouraged to break off contact with relatives outside. Newspapers were reviewed and cut up before they reached the hands of community members. Radio and television were controlled and information was filtered. And it was during this period that the first serious accusations began to accumulate, which would later lead to arrests, trials, and conviction. But back then, in the beginning, for most people inside Gloriavale, it seemed like a perfectly ordered world, created by a man who, it appeared, knew the way to God better than anyone else. And the more I delve into these details, the more obvious one thing becomes. None of this was chaotic. It was a slow, methodical construction of a system that, from the very beginning, was built on fear, submission, and the absolute power of one man. As the community grew, Neville Cooper became not just the spiritual leader, he became the center of all decisions. By the early 1980s, there was already a clear hierarchy in Gloriavale. Cooper stood at the top. Below him were a few trusted men called shepherds, and beneath them were all the others. This structure allowed him to control the community without having to personally intervene in every little detail. It was during this period that the first evidence began to emerge that something much more sinister was happening behind the facade of a pure life. Former members of the community later recounted that Cooper gradually began to blur the boundaries of what was permissible, especially regarding physicality and sexuality. He spoke a lot about the sin of the flesh, but at the same time insisted that people should be pure through complete openness and submission. One of the key moments was when Cooper began to hold so-called spiritual conversations with young women and teenagers. Formally, this looked like pastoral care, but according to the victims' testimonies, these conversations quickly crossed the line. He convinced them that bodily shame was an invention of the sinful world and that through the right kind of contact, a person could be cleansed. That is exactly how in the mid-1980s, there were several incidents of sexual violence that at the time were known only within the community. The most well-known case is connected to Yvette Olsen, who was a teenager in the 1980s. According to her, Cooper raped her using a wooden object, explaining it as a form of spiritual healing. She remained silent for years, not because she didn't understand what had happened to her, but because she was told, if she speaks out, she will destroy the community and bring down wrath, God's wrath. At the same time, Cooper was actively promoting the practice of public confession. People were forced to admit their sins in front of the entire community. It could be something minor. A doubt, a thought about running away, dissatisfaction. But after such confessions, a person would lose all reputation and become completely dependent on the leader's forgiveness. This was yet another way to maintain control. In 1993 to 1994, the situation began to go beyond the boundaries of the community. Several former members who managed to escape turned to the New Zealand police, and in 1994, law enforcement conducted a search at Gloriavale. For many members of the community, this was a shock. For years they had been told that the state was the enemy, and any outside interference was persecution for their faith. And in 1995, Neville Cooper was found guilty on several counts of indecent assault. The court determined that he had abused his position as a spiritual leader. At first, he was sentenced to 6 years in prison, but after an appeal, the sentence was reviewed, and he spent less than 2 years in jail. This moment is extremely important. When Cooper was released and returned to the community, he was not rejected. On the contrary, he was welcomed as a martyr. People were told that he had become a victim of the satanic system that was trying to destroy the true faith. Most members of Gloriavale never found out what exactly he had been convicted for. The information was filtered. After his return, Cooper actually tightened his control even further. It was at that time that the community finally moved to the west coast of the South Island, to an even more isolated area. The land was vast, and dormitories were built there where several families lived together. Privacy almost completely disappeared. By the 2000s, Gloriavale had already become a well-established economic structure. The community owned dairy farms, an aviation company, and meat processing enterprises. All these businesses generated millions of dollars a year, but community members did not receive any wages. A court later determined that people worked more than 60 to 70 hours a week without pay. So, after the death of Cooper's first wife, he married several more times. One of the most shocking facts: his third wife, Ruth, was a teenager when he, already an elderly man, took her as his wife. This marriage was presented as God's will, and no one in the community had the right to discuss it. Cooper died in 2018 of cancer at the age of 92. For many, it seemed like the end of an era, but in reality, it was only the beginning of a new stage of revelations. After his death, testimonies about abuse that had lasted for decades began to emerge en masse. In 2022 and 2025, several leaders, including Gloriavale, Howard, and Temple, who led the community after Cooper, were found guilty of sexual crimes against women and children. In 2025, Temple pleaded guilty to several charges. This was the moment when even the most prominent members of the community could no longer pretend that nothing was happening. At the same time, New Zealand courts ruled that the work in Gloriavale was not voluntary. People were officially recognized as victims of forced labor. This decision was historic because for the first time, the authorities officially called things by their proper names. And still, despite the verdicts, despite the investigations, despite dozens of ruined lives, Gloriavale continues to exist. Hundreds of people still live there, children are still being born there, and there is still a system that for decades taught people to stay silent. The longer I worked with material about this sect, Gloriavale, the more clearly I saw one pattern. When a system exists for decades without oversight, violence within it stops being an exception and becomes the background. It no longer seems like something extraordinary, it becomes part of everyday life. That is exactly what happened in Gloriavale in the late 2000s and early 2010s. The death song of Neville Cooper in 2000. In 2018, many people expected that the community would begin to change. Officially, leadership passed to a man named Howard Temple, who for years had been one of Cooper's closest associates. At that time, he was over 80 years old. He presented himself as a softer leader, spoke about repentance, about the need to move forward, but the facts told a different story. It was during this period that cases began to emerge, not only related to sexual violence, but also to deaths that could have been avoided. In 2015, a 14-year-old girl named Prior Reddy died in Gloriavale. She had Down syndrome and was kept in a so-called isolation room. This was a room where sick members of the community were sent to prevent the spread of infection. That day, Prior began to choke while eating. According to testimony, her food had not been properly prepared. The door to the isolation room had its handles blocked. This was done deliberately so that people could not leave without permission. When the girl began to choke, the adults nearby who were overwhelmed could not quickly call for help. One of them had to climb out through the window. By the time help reached Pryor, it was already too late. She died. The investigation lasted for years, and in 2020 the coroner officially stated that the locking of the doors was not a decisive factor in her death. This decision led to... It sparked a wave of outrage among former members of the community. It wasn't said in anger, nor was it said calmly, but rather as part of a logic in which the death of a child is not a tragedy, but merely an element of the system. Another case that deeply affected me was the death of a 20-year-old man. His name was Sincere Standruye. In 2018, he was deaf and, according to relatives, likely had autism. Gloriavale? He was systematically bullied both by other young men and by older men. He was punished for not listening to orders, forced to live separately from his family, and humiliated. But in June 2018, he was found unconscious in the paint shop. He later died in the hospital. The official version, an accident related to so-called choking games that were allegedly practiced among the youth. But his family, especially his sister Rose, categorically disagreed with this. She publicly stated that his mental health had been ignored for years, that he had suffered physical and sexual abuse, and that the system simply broke him. And this is where it becomes clear that Gloriavale doesn't kill quickly, it kills slowly. Through isolation, through humiliation, through the absence of choice. In 2018, another case became public. Connie Reddy, senior sister Pryor, went to the police with a statement against her own father, the same Clem Reddy. And she revealed that for years, she suffered brutal beatings as a child. The court found her testimony credible. The father was convicted and, importantly, he himself admitted that his behavior was a direct result of the cult, Gloriavale, where physical punishment of children was considered the norm. After that, Clem Reddy began to openly ask questions to the community leadership. He spoke about violence, about sexual abuse, about hypocrisy. The response was expulsion. He and his wife were essentially evicted from the dormitory, but they didn't go far because all their children, grandchildren, and the graves of their loved ones remained on the territory of Gloriavale. They became a kind of outcasts within the community. At the same time, in 2019 and 2023, criminal cases against other men began to emerge en masse. In Gloriavale, Joseph Hope, Timothy Disciple, Ben Kana, Jonathan Benjamin, all of them were found guilty of sexual crimes against children. Some of these crimes lasted for decades, in certain cases since the 1980s. The verdict in 2024 was especially shocking when Jonathan Benjamin was sentenced to nearly 12 years in prison for a series of crimes against children under the age of 5. The court found that the community leadership was aware of his behavior and failed to report it to the police for years. Instead, he was forced to repent before the community and was allowed to remain around children. And here again the question arises, from whom is it impossible to escape? How many crimes have never become cases? According to New Zealand police, as of 2024, more than 130 victims of physical and sexual abuse connected to Gloriavale had been identified, and over 400 possible crimes. But even the investigators themselves admit that the real numbers are much higher. Many people are still afraid to speak out. Gloriavale is not the failure of one person, it's the failure of decades of silence, the failure of a system that allowed it. A religious community to exist outside of real oversight, hiding behind faith. It became clear to me one more thing. This cult survived not because it was hidden, but because for years it was allowed to survive. It existed literally in plain sight of the state, with documentary filmmakers, journalists, court cases, statements from former members, and yet it continued to operate almost unchanged. One of the key reasons for this was money. Gloriavale is not a poor sect, it is an economically powerful organization. According to various estimates, the total value of the community's assets exceeded 18 million New Zealand dollars, and its annual profits amounted to several million. And all this business was sustained by the labor of people who did not receive any wages. Adults worked 60 to 70 hours a week, and children from the age of 5 or 6. They worked on farms, in workshops, in kitchens, and in factories. For years, the state officially accepted the community's position. They said these were volunteers, that it was a religious choice. But in reality, most of these people never made a choice. They were born in Gloriavale. They knew no other life. They were convinced from childhood that refusing to work meant sin, hell, and losing your family. From 2017 to 2020, New Zealand's Department of Labour conducted an investigation into forced labour and twice concluded that no employment relationship existed. This decision sparked outrage among former members of the community. They publicly stated that women born into the cult, who never had any other choice, were called volunteers. This became a turning point. In 2022, when former members of the Gloriavale community filed a multi-million-dollar civil lawsuit demanding recognition that they were employees, not volunteers. The court examined the living conditions in detail. No wages, no possibility to leave, psychological pressure, religious isolation, and the court sided with the plaintiffs. For the first time, it was officially recognized. This is not volunteering, this is exploitation. This decision became one of the most serious blows to Gloriavale in its entire history, because it undermined not only the finances but the very ideological foundation, the myth of voluntary devotion. At the same time, new investigations into the community leadership began. And in 2025, already after Cooper's death, it became known that Howard, the same elderly man who had taken over the community, pleaded guilty to numerous instances of indecent acts and sexual abuse against women and children. He publicly admitted that in Gloriavale there was a practice of not reporting crimes to the police, but instead resolving issues within the community. In fact, he confirmed what former members had been saying for decades. The system was built not to protect the victims, but to protect the community itself. And even after this, Gloriavale did not cease to exist. In 2024 to 2025, about 600 people lived there, more than half of them children. Children who likewise do not have access to a proper education, do not have independent doctors, have no privacy, and lack the language to describe violence as violent. Another aspect that cannot be ignored is international expansion. Before his death, Cooper authorized the creation of a daughter team and a similar community in India, in the state of Tamil Nadu. Young women from Gloriavale were sent there essentially for marriages with local men and to recreate the same system under a different banner. Former members and human rights advocates have called this a form of human trafficking. Investigations are still ongoing. And when I look at this whole story as a whole, from 1969, when Cooper gathered his first followers, until today, I don't see a strange one. A religious experiment. I see a structure that for decades has taught people not to trust themselves, not to trust the world, and to remain silent even when that silence kills. Gloriavale did not appear overnight. It was built step by step through charisma, through fear, through isolation, and through the belief that suffering is the norm and freedom is a sin. And the scariest thing in this story for us, the reality is that there were dangerous individuals and criminals there. and that the entire institutional system did everything in its power to make sure the crimes never looked like crimes. When people finally leave Gloriavale, they don't simply enter the normal world. They step out into a vast and terrifying void. Most of these people have no money, no education, no documents in the usual sense, no parental account, and no experience making decisions on their own. They leave a place where everything was decided for them their whole lives, and enter a world where suddenly they have to think for themselves. Many of those who escaped admit that the first weeks were not filled with joy, but with panic. People didn't understand how to buy food, how to use public transport, or how to make a doctor's appointment. They didn't know what renting an apartment was, what bills, taxes, or job interviews were. Some didn't know how to use a phone or an ATM. Some didn't know that you could just sit down and do nothing, without needing permission. Psychologically, it's even harder. People leave the cult with a deep sense of guilt. They feel as if they have betrayed their family, as if they have gone against God, that at any moment someone could come for them and something could happen to them. Illness, accident, death as punishment. This fear doesn't appear right away. It can hold on for years. Many former members talk about having nightmares, about constantly expecting that someone will come and say, "You did something wrong." About the fear of making even simple decisions, what to wear, where to go, what to say, what to eat. Because in Gloriavale, others always made decisions for you. It's especially hard for women. They come out of a system where their value was measured only by their obedience, ability to work, and bearing children. In the outside world, they had to relearn that their body belongs only to them, that they can say the word no. And that this is normal, not a test of faith. Some people can't handle this transition, which is why there are those who return to the community, not because it's good there, but because it's familiar. The fear of the unknown can be even greater than the fear of gaining freedom. But there are other stories as well. There are those who left Gloriavale and built a new life. Some individuals pursued a formal education, while others started working. Some even bravely went to work for the very first time after turning 50 years old. They gradually developed their own unique opinions and perspectives. They began to truly, deeply understand themselves and the world around them for the first time. Think for themselves, and almost all of them say the same thing. The most important thing is to understand that the world is not as it was painted for them, that the outside world is not pure sin, that people can be good without control, that freedom is not a curse. Gloriavale? It still exists, and there are still children and people living there who know no other life. There are still people there who sincerely believe that suffering is the path to salvation, and that perhaps is the scariest part. Because a system built on fear can last a very long time if it is called by its true name. This story is not just about a community in New Zealand. It's about how easily religion can turn into a tool of control. How the charisma of one person can ruin the lives of hundreds. And how the silence of the state, neighbors, and society allows this to go on for decades. Gloriavale did not appear suddenly, it was built up gradually. And in the same gradual way, it can be dismantled, not by force, but by truth. With every testimony, every verdict, every person who managed to come forward and say, this was not normal. And as long as we talk about such stories, this system has less chance of surviving. So thank you very much for walking this long and difficult path with me today. And I truly hope you found it deeply interesting to learn more in extensive detail about this mysterious sect, this dangerous cult, and about this manipulative, charismatic preacher who ultimately destroyed hundreds of innocent lives and families. And I hope that one day we will hear in the news that this sect has been shut down, that people have come to their senses, and that they have stopped believing that punishment is the path to paradise. So thank you, and I'll see you in the next video.